Okay. As I said, chapter 14 on the family and intimate relationships is what we're going to be covering today. Some of the things we'll be taking a look at: a global view of the family, sociological perspectives on the family, marriage and the family, divorce, diverse lifestyles, social policy in the family, gay marriage. Questions, of course, we'll be trying to answer: what are families in different parts of the world like? How do people select mates? When a marriage fails, how does the divorce affect children? And what are the alternatives to the nuclear family, and how prevalent are they? So, family is one of those what we call kind of cultural universals that exists in some form or another in every society. But it varies greatly from society to society. Social researchers kind of understand now that roles within the family are very fluid, and the style and size of family we find in different societies varies. One kind of common way of thinking about families is the nuclear family, which is really just parents and children, and then the extended family, which can be multiple generations in addition to aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers. The extended family living in close proximity to each other would have been much more common kind of in the agrarian era of U.S. history. Now the nuclear family is the most common family form found here in the U.S. Although we are beginning to see a phenomenon whereby, owing to certain economic circumstances, we're seeing what's called the sandwich generation, where parents are supporting both grandparents and children within the same household, which would be more kind of an extended family rather than the nuclear family. But the nuclear family is really kind of came into dominance as the dominant family form here in the U.S. society once the Industrial Revolution had progressed. And this was because the jobs moved off of the farms and into the factories, and so families would have to move to wherever the work was. Of course, monogamy is the most prevalent form of family here in the United States of America. One man, one woman, and are married only to each other, although if you're a reality TV show fan, of course, you realize there's sister wives, in which there's one man with, I think they're up to 4 wives now. I'm not sure. I believe they added just another wife just recently. And then, of course, Big Love, which was a Showtime TV drama along the same lines, looking at polygamy, specifically polygyny, which is one man with multiple wives. Polyandry is not something, which is where you have one woman with multiple husbands, is not something I've seen kind of represented in any of the materials I've come across. It exists as a theoretical, but I'm not sure if it's ever actually existed as an empirical kind of thing. Another thing that, interestingly enough, is not really discussed in this chapter, and I just wanted to bring it up briefly, but it's growing in recognition, is the idea of polyamory, which is where they may not have legal arrangements, but it's the idea of an open marriage, where each partner is free to develop significant relationships with individuals outside the marriage. It's not hugely common in U.S. society, but it's growing as a trend enough that they have begun addressing it with research in Psychology Today and some other scientific kind of magazines and journals. In the United States of America, we might more accurately be categorized not as monogamists, but as serial monogamists, in which we go from monogamous relationship to monogamous relationship. We value monogamy, but not lifelong monogamy. If you talk about true monogamy, that's a lifelong commitment between two people, we tend to value monogamous relationships, but we aren't necessarily committed to them for our entire lives. And so the average is actually, for a person who's been married, the average number of times they've been married is 2. So we do see that we only have one spouse at a time, but we're having multiple spouses throughout our lives. I've only been married once. My brother James has only been married once, but my other 2 brothers have both been married twice. So just within our 4 brothers, of course, the average would be 1.5. However, my brother Chris, his first ex-wife, has been married 6 times. That's kind of when you're reaching Elizabeth Taylor dimensions as far as marriage goes. So we really do value monogamy, but not lifelong committed monogamy. Polygamy, as I mentioned, is when an individual has several spouses, husbands or wives simultaneously. Polygamy is one man, multiple women in a marriage. This is what's practiced by certain denominations of the Church of Latter-day Saints. The one that I can think of specifically that practices it in a very extreme form would be the Fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints. This is the one that Warren Jeffs headed. And this is the one where young girls, 14, 15, 16 years old, were being forcibly married against their will to much older men. Warren Jeffs, of course, is now serving a jail sentence and is in jail. But polygamy is, if you're going to have kind of polygamous marriage, polygyny, G-Y-N-Y, is the form that is most commonly represented. Polyandry, as I said, I am not aware of any specific instances where that has existed either historically or currently. It exists just as the theoretical opposite of polygyny. I believe there is some evidence, what I've heard is that there may be some evidence that it existed among the Celtic tribes, that it existed among certain Native American tribes, but as neither of these societies left written records of times before they haven't left any historical records of it, we can only think about it as existing in a theoretical way. So when we talk about family, what we're talking about is the people to whom we're related. So it's bonds of kinship, and kinship is just the people to whom you're married by ties of blood or other types of arrangements. Adoption, fostering, guardianship, these are all legal arrangements that set up a family unit outside of blood ties. And in fact, marriage itself creates a nuclear family unit between 2 people who were not related prior to that, except there are 24 states in the United States of America that permit first cousins to marry. And Indiana is one of them. So, when we talk about tracing our heritage, there are kind of 3 ways to do this. A bilateral descent, in which both sides of a person's family are regarded as equally important. Patrilineal descent, only the father's relatives are important. And matrilineal descent, in which only the mother's relatives are important. Patrilineal descent is the prevalent form of tracing family history. Anybody who's ever tried to kind of, prior to the internet age, has tried to trace their family history, it's much easier to trace back along your father's history, because in the United States of America, that's whose name is generally assigned to the children. Matrilineal descent would be when you're tracing back the mother's heritage. That becomes much more difficult in United States society, simply because if you go back more than 100 years, records have been destroyed, records are hard to keep. It's much easier to trace back following a name than it is trying to figure out who married who. Bilateral descent, this is where we see the hyphenates prevalent, where you have two last names and both last names are equally important. This is kind of the norm in a lot of Spanish societies. When you think of last names where you see it hyphenated, like Garcia Ruiz, in the case of, actors and actresses who have the longer Spanish names, and they may have a hyphenated name like that. I can think of Gabriel Garcia Ruiz, and one name is coming from the father's side and one name is coming from the mother's side. And I believe it's actually the father's side is the first name, the mother's side is the second name. I'm not entirely positive of that. I do know that that is where the hyphenates come from. That is a practice that has been adopted by some people in the United States of America. I know, for example, my cousin Jennifer, when she married her husband Sean, they decided to go with a hyphenate, and she is Jennifer Murphy's Powers, and her husband is Sean Powers Murphy. They actually reversed the order of the hyphenate so that each of them kept their original last name as the final name of the hyphenate. And that would be a bilateral descent. Of course, this can become cumbersome. If you think about it, 4 generations in, kids could have, 4 names. A hyphenated last name of 4 names. Usually what will happen is the children will select father's or the mother's name when they grow up to become their legal name, or when they get married, they will choose one of those names to be their legal name if they decide to create another hyphenate name. Patrilineal descent is what you typically find in patriarchal societies. Patriarchy is where males are expected to dominate in all family decision-making. When we talk about traditional family values here in the United States of America and a return to traditional family values, as you hear referenced by politicians, oftentimes they are referring to a traditional family arrangement in which it's a nuclear family. The mother stays home, takes care of the children. The father is the one that goes out and works. As the father is the primary breadwinner, he is also the one responsible for making decisions. Most societies descended out of European societies are patriarchies. Matriarchy would be the opposition to this, in which women have greater authority than men. And then you have an egalitarian household, in which family spouses are regarded as equals and participate equally in decision-making, usually with discussion, trying to reach a consensus as to what the best decision might be, rather than one person being able to say, I've made the decision, this is how it's going to be. Functionalism, of course, views things in the terms of the functions they provide for individuals and society. Family serves 6 functions. When we think about this, reproduction, new members of society are only created in the family as a unit. So the family has the societal responsibility of producing new members of society. We don't live in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World where babies are produced in factories or cloning or anything like that. In our society, family is the institution that is expected to produce new members of society. They're also expected to protect those new members of society until they're ready to strike out on their own. Socialization, of course, the first place we start learning appropriate behavior is in the home. Our parents teach us things like potty training is socialization, but also not hitting brothers and sisters, saying please and thank you. These are the kinds of things we learn early in the family life. Regulation of sexual behavior. Now, that's a little bit broader. When we think about that, the way that the family as a unit regulates sexual behavior is essentially by saying the people to whom you're already related, you can't choose for sexual activity. So, in the United States of America, in all 50 states, you can't marry your sister or brother, mother or father, grandmother or grandfather. Those relationships are prohibited specifically. As I said, depending on where in the United States of America you live, first cousins may be prohibited. Most people get a little shudder down the spine when I talk about first cousins getting married, though, and they think, ew, that's gross. But like I said, there are 24 states in the United States of America that permit it, and we're in one of them right here. The interesting thing is a lot of people would make the assumption that that's kind of centered down in the southern states, and that's not the case. You actually find it up along the northeastern seaboard, spreading out across the Midwest, and then, like Arizona permits that too. So down in the Southwest as well. But it's kind of spread throughout the country. It's not geographically isolated to any one region. Affection and companionship, of course, which would be kind of expressive needs of individuals in the family. And then provision of social status, because our family determines our entry point into society. Depending on whether we're lower, middle, or upper class, our particular entry point is based upon our family. And so these are the 6 functions that family serves for society, according to the Functionalist View. Now, moving on to the conflict view, of course, here we find a little bit of difference. Conflict is all about inequality, and Karl Marx believed that family, just like religion, the economy, politics, reproduces inequality. So family reflects inequality in wealth and power found within society and actually reproduces that inequality. The functionalist perspective says that the family is the provider of social status by determining entry point. Conflict says yes, because family reproduces inequality. Of course, we've got gender inequality within the family as well. Pretty much most societies that have left any kind of recorded history have left records that the husbands and fathers are the decision makers in the family. And so husbands have exercised power and authority within the family. In fact, Amnesty International, as one of the 4 forms of slavery that are still prevalent on a global scale, defines servile marriage as one of them. This is a marriage in which a woman actually becomes a servant and is considered almost like property of her husband. And this is still very common in certain parts of the world. Another way that Marx said families reproduce social inequality is through the practice of inheritance. And if you think about that, kind of like, what did Paris Hilton do to deserve $1 billion fortune? She was born into the right family. Now, I know that she has, done some things as far as TV shows and recording albums and movies and social advocacy. She is involved with several charities now. But when you think about it, did that create her fortune, or is that a result of her already having a fortune? Is Paris Hilton famous? Did her fame create her fortune, or did her fortune create her fame? The fortune created the fame, because chances are she wouldn't have had a TV show, a record album, or a movie appearance in like House of Wax. She wouldn't have appeared in movies without already having been a member of the Hilton family, which is one of the wealthier families in the United States of America. She is an heir of the Hilton Hotel family, the ones that created the Hilton Hotel. So, conflict views family as an economic unit that contributes to social injustice, specifically through the practice of inheritance, according to Marx. Feminists have broadened that view out and said, yes, however, it also reproduces social inequality between the genders. Now, the functionalist perspective would actually say that the division of labor within the household, where men are responsible for the instrumental tasks and women are responsible for the expressive tasks, while it may not benefit every single individual, it benefits the overall structure and stability of society, because it ensures that all those 6 functions are taken care of. Children have both the instrumental tasks and the expressive tasks met. They're cared for emotionally, they're comforted, things like that, and they're also protected and provided for in society. The interactionist view looks at how our ideas and the meanings we attach to our roles within family structure our behaviors within the family. It's interested in how individuals interact with each other, whether they're married or just cohabitating. And so it focuses on how our ideas about family roles, who should be doing what within the family, structure the nature of our interaction within that family unit. Feminists, of course, look at family as a social institution. And remember, if we understand that feminists view gender as a master status, this plays into the way that they examine family. Oftentimes, we hear it said that single-parent households produce lower outcomes, worse outcomes for children. This is not necessarily true. One of the things that is said about that is the fact that children need both a male and a female. Both male and female children need male and female role models in order to be properly socialized. Feminists are trying to urge social scientists and researchers to rethink that notion, and also the agencies, social work, CPS, things like that, that are responsible for child welfare at kind of a governmental policy level. And they stress the need to investigate neglected topics in family studies. Essentially, feminists say that for a long time, research done within the field of the social sciences, whether it's psychology, sociology, what have you, focused on the male experience as the norm and really ignored the female experience, except as it deviated from the male experience. Of course, the most kind of prominent example of that in my mind is Sigmund Freud's ideas on women suffering from penis envy. Essentially, Freud believed that the problems women have is that they're not men. And so that's totally discounting the experiences of women as legitimate experiences, and legitimate in the sense of being worthy of theoretical and applied social research being done there. So feminists are kind of stressing the need to look at some of these other topics within society, and then more specifically within the family. So those are our four theoretical perspectives: functionalism, conflict, interaction, and feminism. Now we're going to go and look on how does the family actually get started. Believe it or not, the idea of romantic love as the basis of a family unit, as the basis of marriage and the beginning of a family unit, is a recent phenomenon, even here in the United States of America. If you go back 150 years, you would find that there are still a lot of arranged marriages being done here in the United States of America. There are some things that kind of govern choice of mate. Beyond when we even think about just where can we choose mates from. Are we truly free in the United States of America to pick anybody we want? No, there are restrictions on that. Endogamy is the requirement that individuals select a mate within a particular group, and it prohibits marriage with members of other groups. A lot of endogamous marriage requirements are founded in kind of religion. Jewish, the goal there is for the Jewish people not to marry a Gentile, but to marry somebody who's Jewish. The Catholic Church, if you want to get married in a Catholic Church, both members in the wedding have to be Catholic. Within the caste system in Hindu religion in India, you're restricted to marriage within your particular caste. Exogamy is the requirement that you select a mate outside a particular group. Like you can't go to a family reunion looking for a spouse to begin a new family with. So usually that has to be the usual restriction there is that you need to go outside the family. And so that's an exogamous requirement. When we look at societies who have tribe or clan patterns of social arrangement, those tend to be familial arrangements. And in those societies where you have tribes or clan, either all the young men or all the young women will be required to go to a different tribe or clan to select a mate, because everybody within a particular tribe or clan is considered to be related to each other. It's an example of what's referred to as the incest taboo. So when we think about exogamous marriage requirements, what we're usually finding there is an incest taboo, some type of incest taboo in operation. Now, there are class-based differences in the application of the incest taboo. If you're familiar at all with European history, you will know that the Habsburg family, which is actually the descendants of the Holy Roman Empire centered in Austria, in Vienna, Austria, are related to just about every ruling family in Europe, and it's a very, very, like, they're all kind of related. And so in order to consolidate power, prohibitions on common people against marrying within the family are relaxed for nobles and royals at times, and that would be to consolidate social power. So we've been talking about this. Sexual relations between certain culturally specified relationships, usually arranged around some form of kinship, are found in just about every society. In fact, I don't believe there is a society in which there is not some form of the incest taboo. It's one of the cultural universals, in addition to things like the prohibition on murder. Now, it may be defined differently from society to society, but it exists in some form in every society. And then, of course, outside of these restrictions we have on who we can choose, there are other restrictions as well. Even if we just go beyond family, there are still restrictions. In our society, you can't select somebody who's 10 years old and say, I want to marry that person. That's just not allowed. So we have age restrictions on who can get married as well. And you're required to select within certain age groups. You can't select outside the legal age for marriage. And then beyond this, of course, is just the fact that we like people who are like us. So we have homogamous tendencies in mate selection as well. It may be a popular trope in movies and TV series and romance novels that opposites attract, but if you're a complete opposite from somebody, that will not be the good foundation of a marriage, because in general, we need some common basis in order to develop effective bonds. And if you think, the way that we rate things like how intelligent is somebody, how much do their views align with us? People that we consider to be unintelligent generally have opposing views. People who agree with us, we consider them to be much more intelligent. So we tend to like people who are like ourselves, and this is reflected in mate selection. So we tend to select mates who have personal characteristics similar to our own. There may be some differences in there, but there has to be some commonality, inevitably. I can talk about James Carville and his wife. He's a very, very extreme Democrat. His wife is actually an advisor for the Republican Party. But my guess is that that's one of a few differences they have, and they have other common interests. In fact, the fact that they're both very politically active may be what unites them in a certain sense. Even though they support different policies in different parties, they do have that shared interest in politics and in being politically active. So we tend to select people who have at least a few things in common with us. We like people who are like ourselves. So, at this point in time in our society, it is pretty widely accepted that love is the only basis for marriage. Parents encourage children to find somebody who they love to get married. They don't think about trying to arrange marriages for them anymore. And so love and affection are the basis of marriage in the United States of America. And a lot of times in my face-to-face classes, when I may get a little discussion on this, because believe it or not, love as the basis for marriage has a very low success rate when compared to arranged marriage. Arranged marriage actually has a much higher success rate and a much lower divorce rate. Some of that may be because you find arranged marriage in more conservative societies, but some of that also inevitably comes from homogamy, because when parents decide to arrange a marriage, they are looking for the best possible mate for their child. And so they select on economic circumstances, religious, social, all educational, all kinds of different criteria that love can sometimes mask, especially, when we meet at places where not everybody's interest, status, and things like that are known. You go out to a club at night, look across the dance room floor, lock eyes with somebody, you feel that electricity. Yeah, that's a great feeling, but that doesn't tell you anything about how much you and that person have in common, other than you look at them and it inspires feelings of attraction. You're physically attracted to them, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily mentally or emotionally compatible. And so in the U.S., it is kind of the norm. That is not true throughout the world. Other cultures look at, as I said, class, status, religious affiliation, things like that, when the parents are making these decisions. Social class differences, again, Pretty Woman is a great movie, a lot of fun to watch. It's a little bit of a complete fairy tale because class is another one of those areas in which people tend to select mates homogamously. Now, when we think about just family in general, family life in general, there are differences. Think about what it means to be a Kennedy or a Rockefeller or a Vanderbilt or one of these other kind of big name families in the United States of America that a lot of people are beginning to believe are noble or aristocratic class. But they do emphasize lineage and maintenance of family position. This is, of course, in direct opposition where you find lower class families are likely to only have one parent at home, and children have to assume some of the adult responsibilities. Many times in families, children become older children become sort of surrogate parents for younger children. Even in households where you have both parents present, you may find this simply because 66% of the households in the United States of America where you have two parents present, both parents are working in order to maintain a particular lifestyle. But it's less noticeable today, the class-based differences, than it used to be. One of the reasons for that is the ease of divorce following the equal rights movement. Divorce is much easier to obtain. Irreconcilable differences can be the basis of a divorce. That would not have been strong enough cause in 1920, 1930 for a family to get, for a couple to get divorced. They couldn't just cite irreconcilable differences. That was one of the things that kind of accompanied the equal rights movement. Now, I'm not saying that making divorce easier is a bad thing, but it has eradicated some of these class-based differences. It has also allowed women to escape abusive home situations, and in that respect, having divorce granted easier is much more beneficial for women and children. It's better for families to split up if there's a lot of emotional and physical abuse going on in there. We do have different patterns on the basis of race and ethnicity as well. In African American communities, you tend to have really, really well-developed kinship networks that don't just include family members, but that also include neighbors and friends. This has to do a lot with the very, very high incarceration rate of African American males and the fact that there's a much, much higher percentage of female-headed single-parent households amongst the African American communities than in society in general. And so in order to make sure that the needs of the children are met, they develop these kind of kin networks where it's a cooperative effort. It's kind of like the idea behind it takes a village to raise a child. So the communities are much more strongly developed there. Native American families, cushion hardships. Having a larger family, again, makes it easier to provide for the needs of the children. Mexican-American families tend to be much more traditionally oriented. They tend to reflect what we would call the traditional family values, with the father working, making decisions, the mother staying home and taking care of children. And some of that has to do with religious observations in that Mexican-Americans tend to be overwhelmingly Catholic, and Catholicism tends to promote these types of family ideas and family arrangements. Now, I'm not saying that's the case for every single Mexican-American family or every single Catholic family. I'm talking about generalizations, trends, and tendencies there. But really, machismo does play a big part in Mexican-American families, and this is the idea of the male as provider, protector, and head of the household. And machismo is very important in the Mexican culture. Familism is pride in extended family. This is something that you might find more prevalent in minority families, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Everybody can take pride in their family and their family history, and that would be familism. For example, I know quite a bit about the history of my family name. It's been traced all the way back to 1639 in this country, which is when my ancestors arrived here. So my family's been in this country for close to 400 years at this point in time. When we think about child rearing, raising children, which the family is really responsible for protection until at least age 18, unless the child gets emancipated earlier, and socialization, family is really the only socializing unit up to about age 5, and then it remains important. So the socialization of children. It's not really about anticipatory socialization. Remember all the way back to the chapters on socialization. Anticipatory socialization is something that happens more with adults. Adults tend to think about, what do I need to do for this next stage of my life? Like, I'm starting a new job tomorrow, so how am I going to dress? How am I going to act? Am I going to be open? Am I going to be quiet? Am I going to be loud and boisterous? These kind of things. All of that can be regarded as anticipatory socialization. Children live kind of in the now, so they don't really think much about the future. The future tends to be more of an amorphous, abstract concept. It's something that happens later. So there's not a whole lot. Limited learning during pregnancy. There is evidence that in the third trimester, fetus do absorb some information, some knowledge. But if we think about the parents, how many parents actually go out and read books on being children or on raising children? The transition to parenthood is abrupt. In fact, a lot of times in our society, people are not, they don't kind of do any anticipatory socialization on this, thinking about how many children do we want in our family, how are we going to raise these children, are we going to use corporal punishment, are we going to use non-corporal punishment, are we going to try to reward good behavior, how are we going to do this? And in our society, there is little consensus on how to produce happy, well-adjusted offspring. Really, when we kind of think about this, children do well and do poorly in all different types of family arrangements and social class settings. There are children that come from two-parent households who are not happy or well-adjusted. There are children that come from one-parent households who are happy and well-adjusted. Talked about the sandwich generation, which is something we'll talk about in a second, but it is becoming increasingly common for children to be living at home with their parents up to and sometimes even past the age of 30. Some of that has to do with the recession, not being able to find work, things like that. But it's just becoming a little bit more common, a little bit more acceptable to stay home later in life and to strike out on your own later in life. Or after having struck out, actually returning to home. That would be what's called the boomerang generation, the generation of children who have tried to strike out on their own, have not been successful, and then have returned home. Full nest syndrome, this is where, following college, they just kind of move back in and live with the parents for an extended period of time until they strike out on their own. Adoption, of course, is a legal relationship that establishes the parent-child relationship. Once you adopt somebody, you do assume responsibility for them. Should be noted, however, that there are some loopholes in that law, and in some states, parents who adopt children and then struggle with it can just give those children away to friends, and there is no law prohibiting that or preventing that. It's been in the news just recently. But yes, this is something that there are loopholes in adoption laws that do allow, I think some states may restrict it within the first year or something like that, but it is not illegal in some states for adoptive parents to foist the children off on other people with no consequences of that. But essentially, when you adopt a children, what you're agreeing to is becoming the parent for that child, establishing a relationship that's every bit as strong as a blood relationship. That's the idea behind it. Dual income families, as I said, roughly 66-67% families in the United States of America, both parents work. In fact, just talk about that a little bit briefly. This whole idea of what's called the traditional family unit, where the father works, the mother stays home and takes care of the children, isn't that rooted in tradition, because it's a fairly recent phenomenon, and it really only existed for a particular class of people at a particular window in time. Roughly between the end of World War II and about 1977 into 80 was the only time you saw this really explode. For lower class members of society, dual income families have been the norm for 150 years or so. Both parents had to work. If you think about farming families, both parents work in farming families, and children work too. I know this. My father has talked to me about growing up on a farm. I'm only one generation removed from a farmer. My father grew up on a farm and decided that's not what he wanted his kids to grow up as, so he moved away. But yeah, my grandfather and my grandmother both worked very hard at the farm. My dad and my aunt both were expected to contribute as soon as they can. In fact, my dad likes to talk about learning to drive a tractor at age 5. because Grandpa needed him to do that. So, dual income families is more the norm than the exception, and has been. Right now, married people, 95% of men, 68% of women in the labor force. Believe it or not, women are actually, those numbers are kind of shrinking and growing. The number of men is shrinking and the number of women is growing. Not by huge amounts, but the stay-at-home dad and the mother as the provider is becoming increasingly common in our society. And there are more and more fathers who are opting to stay at home and take care of children. Single-parent families, of course, the result of divorce, the result of childbirth outside of marriage, where there's no cohabitation. This is becoming more and more common. It's no longer as stigmatized in our society as it once was. About 24% of white families with children under 18 were headed by single parents. That's a pretty substantial figure. A quarter of the families. 90% of those will be headed by women. The majority of cases, single-parent households are female-headed households. 37% of Hispanic families with children, so we see a larger number there. And then, of course, African Americans, and there are a number of social forces contributing to that, one of which is differential justice and mass incarceration, in which African American males make up 50% of our prison population when they're only about 6% of our total population. So they are heavily, heavily overrepresented in there. There are, of course, alternating explanations of why that is. The conservative explanation tends to be that there's just higher levels of criminal activity amongst African Americans. Liberals tend to explain it differently by saying the social forces constrain African Americans and don't offer them legitimate opportunities, and so they are forced into that, coupled with differential justice, which is white people and black people being treated entirely different in the criminal justice system, where a white person might receive a slap on the wrist, a black person will be put on trial and probably go to jail. Told you, single fathers was a growing phenomenon. It more than quadrupled from 1987 to 2010, where children are living with the father as opposed to the mother, for whatever reason. Of course, in TV, if you think about the Courtship of Eddie's father, if you think about Father Knows Best, it was never because of divorce, it was always because of death. Or the Brady Bunch, where they never really explained it. They just, two single-parent families, a wife with 3 girls, a husband, a mother with 3 girls, a father with 3 boys, and they never really tell you why each of them was a single parent. But that's a good example leading into this, of course, because step families are becoming increasingly common. Step families are blended families is actually a more appropriate term, because oftentimes it's not just having stepbrothers and stepsisters, it's also having half-brothers and half-sisters sharing one parent but not both parents. So blended families is the more widely used term now, that encompasses step families and families where it's not all step siblings but it's also half siblings. As I said, the average number of marriages for a person who's been married at least once is 2. Approximately almost half our population will marry, divorce, and remarry. In fact, in the 90s, there was actually a phenomenon where people began referring to their first marriage as their practice marriage. Now, let's face it, if you're referring to your first marriage as a practice marriage, you are setting yourself up with the expectation that that marriage is going to fail. You are essentially saying, this is the marriage where I make all the mistakes, so that in the next marriage, I get it all right. And so that kind of betrayed an attitude towards marriage that had been developing culturally, over the 20 years since the Equal Rights Movement. And so here we see the term blended family. Now, it has social significance for adults and children. Technically, I've referenced my brothers, James, Drew, and Chris. Technically, Drew and Chris are my only full brothers. James, I only share a father with him. But in our family, the way that the four of us talk about that is we never talk about half-brothers. We always just call each other brothers. But it does have social significance. Andrew Cherlin, who is a researcher that does a lot of research on families, family structure, and looks at how relationships and whether it's a blended family, a nuclear family, affects children, kind of has this idea that the well-being of children in step families is no better on average than the well-being of children in divorced single-parent households. And in particular cases can actually even be worse. His research is essentially saying that it's not always best to rush out and get married so that children have two role models in the household. There is no empirical evidence demonstrating that being a member of a step family has any more benefit than being a member of a single-parent household. Divorce rates have leveled off. However, something like 50% of the marriages that happen in every year, within a year, those people will be divorced. The divorce rate is still very high here in the United States of America. It has declined somewhat, but it does remain very high. Some of the things that also contribute to this decline beyond just people not getting divorced as much, people waiting until later periods of life to get married. I waited until I was in my 40s to get married for the first time. And if you do get married later in life, you select mates on different bases. So you may select somebody who's more compatible. But part of the reason, of course, aging baby boomer population, which is the big generation in the United States of America, but there's a decline in proportion of people of marriageable age. It just means there's less people from subsequent generations. Here's another statistic for you. 63% of all divorced people have remarried. This is why we talk about serial monogamy, because we tend to go from monogamous relationship to monogamous relationship in U.S. society. I mentioned that there's less stigma associated with divorce now. There's greater social acceptance of it. In the 1940s, especially if you were a woman, being divorced almost meant you became a social pariah. That is no longer true. In fact, my wife, I'm her second husband, and without seeming too immodest, I'll say the better husband, but that's just me being egotistical. But my wife has been married twice. I have only been married once. More liberal divorce laws, as I said, things like irreconcilable differences, allowing people to be granted divorce easier in the courts. Fewer children. Family size has shrunk significantly over the last century. In fact, I believe the average number of children per family now is somewhere around 1.8. Between 1.8 and 2. 2 children per family is the number of children you need for social reproduction to reproduce equal numbers of people in society. Each family member, when it gets together, has to have at least 2 children, or your population size is going to start to decline, because if you think about it, two people only producing one child, that one child does not replace those two people. So for stable population, you need to be having two children. If you're having more than two children, then your population is growing owing to fertility. If you're having less than two children, your population is shrinking. Our population is not shrinking, but the growth in our population actually comes from immigration right now. With regards to mortality and fertility, which is incidence of death and birth, we're pretty much equal. That's why I say it's somewhere between 1.8 and 2 people. 2 children per family. At 2 children per family, you have a stable population that is neither expanding or shrinking other than by immigration and emigration. And it is immigration that contributes to our growth in population. Greater family income. It's easier sometimes for people to think about divorce if finance is not a consideration. Lower class families get hit with this harder than upper class families. Upper class families have the resources to set up 2 independent households. Lower class families, not so much. So if you have a greater family income, it's easier for the family to financially survive divorce and still be provided for and be in good standing. Another thing is just there are opportunities in the economy. Women are no longer restricted to the home, or what we would call the private sphere. Women are much freer now to participate in the economy, the public sphere, by working and things like that. So women having more opportunities means that they're not reliant on remaining with a man for their economic and physical security, essentially, physical, social, and economic security. So how does divorce affect children? One national study says children did not suffer. The behaviors did not suffer. The behaviors did not change. And this was a large enough study to achieve statistical reliability, because with an N of 6,332, that's a fairly large number of subjects there. So the people saying that divorce is harming children and creating bad behavior in children, there may be research out there supporting that, but there is not conclusive research out there supporting that. And there is research that demonstrates it's actually worse for children if the parents remain together but are constantly fighting. That creates worse outcomes for children than parents who go ahead and divorce, and then the children are not in this stressful household in which there's a lot of parental conflict. Regardless of that, it is simplistic to assume that children are automatically better off following a breakup. Just that what you find amongst children with regards to their own self-reporting is that children who live in households where parents are constantly screaming and fighting with each other are unhappier than children in single-parent households where their parents have divorced. Marriage used to be considered a rite of passage, and in fact, in this country, especially for women, if you were a woman who reached age 18 or 19 without being married, you were almost considered an old maid. This is no longer the case. Marriage isn't so much a rite of passage anymore. And the U.S. marriage rate has declined in the past 50 years. Part of the reason for this is people are waiting longer to get married and start families. They're wanting to be more financially secure, so they're marrying after college and after they get a good career going. They're forming partnerships without marriage, which is why a lot of states have passed what are referred to as common law marriages, marriage laws. in which if you cohabitate with an individual for a certain period of time and set up a family structure, even if you haven't gone and officially gotten married, the state considers you married at that point in time. But you can form partnerships without marriage. Cohabitation is no longer as stigmatized as it used to be either. Cohabitation, of course, being male and female couples who choose to live together without marrying. There are some interesting trends with regards to cohabitation prior to marrying. About half of currently married couples in the U.S. say they lived together before marriage. Now, there's some interesting and almost, it seems like, paradoxical statistics regarding this. People who cohabitate prior to marriage and then go through with the marriage have marriages that tend to last longer and be more stable. However, people who cohabitate prior to marriage are less likely to actually go through with getting married. And the way we can think about this is, if you cohabitate with somebody for a year or two before you get married, you're going to know if the marriage is going to work or not. And so, if the marriage isn't going to work, you don't go ahead with it. But if you guys get to the point where, you know, cohabitated and you still want to go ahead with the marriage, then you're guaranteed to have actually probably a little bit more stable marriage. But yeah, cohabitation increases the success and lowers the divorce rate of people who get married, but it also reduces the number of people who actually go through with getting married. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword there if you think about it. More and more people are opting to remain single. I waited so long that my mother actually told me, I thought you had just gotten to the point where you were going to be a terminal bachelor, son. And then you turn around and tell me that you're engaged and planning the wedding. You waited so long before you actually did it, because my other brothers got married when they were much younger, in their 20s. In fact, all three of my brothers got married when they were in their 20s. Well, was James? I think James might have been close to 30. He was either 29 or 30. But yeah, I waited until I was, you know, I guess you would say well into my 40s. So my mom thought I was just going to be a person who remained single for the rest of my life. And then I turn around and get married on her. Imagine that. But if we think about remaining single coupled with people tending to get married later in life, there is a trend towards maintaining a single lifestyle for a longer period that is related to the growing economic independence of younger people. Marriage can be a way of achieving financial security for both partners in the marriage, because you reduce your costs per person when you pool together like that. Marriage without children. Again, this is one of the things that kind of reduces the average. My wife and I talked about it and weren't going to have children. We knew we didn't want to have children. We weren't going to have children once we got married. She has a daughter, so I have a stepdaughter and I have step-grandchildren at this point in time. But we kind of weren't going to have children. And so there's a growth in this phenomenon too, which is part of the reason that if we look at number of children per household, couples like me and my wife actually drag that number down substantially because we don't have any children in our household. So right now, 16 to 17% of women will not have children even if they get married, compared with 10% in 1980. Gay and lesbian relationships. This is right now a hot button issue in the United States of America. Supreme Court decisions have essentially supported gay and lesbian rights with regards to marriage. Same-sex marriage, according to the Supreme Court, is now legal in 30 states. The other 20, it hasn't been challenged in. But the Supreme Court rulings and states that have legislated same-sex marriage on their own mean that in 30 states now, without too much hassle, a same-sex couple can get married. Of course, there is backlash against this, like Alabama Judge Roy Moore, who essentially said, regardless of what the Supreme Court says, I'm not marrying a same-sex couple. So personal and legal discrimination. A lot of states are trying to pass laws. California's Proposition 8, which was one of the propositions the Supreme Court ruled on, essentially said that when a state passes a law restricting marriage to a man and a woman, they violate the Constitution in that people are not being treated equally then. Despite the fact that California's Proposition 8 was overturned by the Supreme Court, other states, including Indiana, have continued to try to press forward on legislation defining marriages between a man and a woman and essentially making same-sex marriage illegal. So when we think about all of this stuff, what are some of the things that make this such a controversial issue? Well, the attitudes towards marriage are complex. Society and culture suggest youth should find the perfect mate and marry. However, if you're gay, society is telling you something a little bit different. You should just accept that you're never going to be able to marry the person you love. Michelle Bachmann kind of made a really ridiculous statement about this. She was asked by a reporter about same-sex people being able to get married. And she responded by saying, well, they are free to marry as long as it's somebody of the opposite sex, completely evading the question. But yeah, there are opposition to this along religious basis. The National Organization for Marriage opposes it, saying that it's destroying the family as a unit. I believe it's in this session that you will be watching the video for Diane Savino's speech on the floor of the New York Senate. Listen carefully to what she has to say about the idea of who's really destroying marriage as an institution in U.S. society, because she's maintaining that it's not gay people, it is other people that are doing that. So when you watch that particular video, I believe it's attached to the discussion board for this class session, think about that. Who is really destroying family values and destroying marriage as an institution? She makes some interesting points. However, marriage, as viewed by a lot of people, is something that is very important in their self-identity, husband or wife. And so some people look at this as an attack on their own marriage instead of an expansion to try to grant more people the right to get married. Vermont, I believe at this point in time, actually has same-sex marriage. A lot of people say, well, we're willing to allow people to set up an arrangement that looks like marriage. We just don't want it called marriage. In fact, here in Indiana, right around the time that they were trying to push HJR, House Joint Resolution 3, through the State House and the State Senate here, there were polls done around that time, and House Joint Resolution 3 was the constitutional amendment in Indiana that was going to define marriages between a man and a woman and prohibit same-sex marriage. But the Indiana lawmakers actually went a little bit too far because they wanted to outlaw civil unions as well. They did not want gay people to be able to set up any kind of social arrangement that was even similar to marriage. They were out of step with the people in Indiana by going to that extreme, because there were polls that indicated that 57% of people in Indiana did favor defining marriages between a man and a woman, but 51% of the people in Indiana also favored allowing civil unions to give same-sex couples essentially the same rights and benefits. And the reason I say essentially there is because in order for a civil union, a civil rights, or a civil union document to provide all the same rights and benefits as a 1 or 2 page marriage license, usually those have to be 40 or 50 pages long. and it all has to be spelled out clearly. And it's just kind of assumed in the marriage license. Things like being closest next of kin, being a power of attorney, making decisions for your spouse should your spouse become incapacitated. All of these are assumed rights and responsibilities under marriage in just about every state. If you want those rights and responsibilities included in a civil union, they have to be very clearly legally spelled out. Otherwise, things that happen like where one partner in a same-sex couple may be in the hospital and the family just decides to deny the other partner in a same-sex couple rights to visit. If you don't have a civil union that clearly spells that out, your next of kin is not your partner. Your next of kin is your closest living family member by blood. And so that's why civil unions as a solution are opposed by the LGBTA community, because they don't all grant the same rights and same responsibilities as a two-page marriage license does. In Massachusetts, the Supreme Court ruled state's constitution gave gay couples the right to marry. I want to say that was around 2006 or 7 when that happened. Instantly, they tried to put a referendum item on altering the Constitution to define marriages between a man and a woman, but that was defeated. Right now, 13 states have actually passed constitutional amendments or legislation granting same-sex couples the right. The other 17 fall under the Supreme Court decisions with regards to this issue. So, if we think about our theoretical approaches here, functionalism would actually say, what benefit does same-sex marriage provide to society as a whole? Because we have to look at, is it creating social stability or is it creating social dysfunction? Marriage is closely tied to reproduction. We cannot ignore that. And religious views cannot be ignored either, because these views are fundamentally important to people in society. And so functionalists would say, maybe this debate over same-sex marriage is beginning to create social dysfunction. However, there is a lot of research. Functionalism also looks at outcomes for children. However, there is a lot of research indicating that as far as children being raised in a same-sex family versus a heterosexual family, there is no difference in outcomes for children. Children come out with essentially the same kind of emotional well-being outcomes, and then later in life they have the same kind of outcomes. So, functionalism looks at it from the benefit of what is it doing. Conflict, of course, is still looking at it from like the whole structure of society, but what it's saying is this is just another example of inequality in society, because you're essentially relegating the LGBTA community to the class of second status citizens. They do not have the same rights and benefits as everybody else in society. And I know some of the arguments against this particular point of view out there are, well, if we allow gay couples to get married, well, then what's next? People wanting to marry children, people wanting to marry dogs and cats, who knows what's coming next? However, we do have some historical evidence that that's not what's going to happen, because those same kind of arguments were made when the Supreme Court struck down all the miscegenation laws preventing interracial marriage. And people were saying, well, if you allow this, then who knows what's next as far as people getting married. It didn't happen. Just because blacks and whites, Hispanics and blacks, Hispanics and whites, Asians and whites, Asians and blacks can all get married now, we haven't seen people trying to say, well, now I want to marry a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old. We haven't seen those kind of ridiculous extremes. It's what in philosophy is referred to as argumentum ad absurdum, in which you take a particular argument and you extend it out to its absurd but logical conclusion. And so that's what these people are doing. It could also be referred to as a straw man argument, in which people are essentially saying gay marriage is just the beginning, and then they set up this straw man of pedophilic marriage where adults are wanting to marry children, or adults are wanting to marry animals in case of bestiality and miscegenation, true miscegenation. it's kind of a straw man because it's ignoring the central issue of consenting adults being denied civil rights. So, and then the interactionist approach, with regards to this, looks at how it plays out in individuals' lives. Support or opposition of family, coworkers, and friends. When you talk about this issue, how does it, is it easier for certain people because of the family they have? You know, is their family advocating for same-sex marriage for them? Coworkers, do coworkers support them? Do friends support them? This kind of stuff. So interactionists look at these issues from the individual level. Thinking about initiating policy. Nations like Great Britain have essentially made same-sex marriage legal. In Britain, you can marry a man or a woman, regardless of which sex you are. So the recognition of same-sex partnerships is not uncommon in Europe. But Europe tends to be a little bit more secular on this issue. America has a lot more religion involved in this particular issue. There is a trend towards recognition, and I believe it was in 2010 that a poll for the first time revealed that a majority of people in the United States of America are in favor of a federal law supporting same-sex marriage at the federal level. Domestic partnership, two unrelated adults sharing a caring relationship, residing together, who agree to be jointly responsible for dependents, basic living expenses, and common necessities. Civil union, domestic partnership, these are the kind of things that are proposed in lieu of calling it marriage. Okay, this ends our discussion for today. Let me see. Jennifer, do you have any questions before we discontinue?
No, I'm good.
Okay. I hope these have been beneficial for you. I really do.
Yeah, I like it. It's nice to have somebody explain it to me a little bit.
Well, like I said, I hope it's been beneficial to you, and I'm planning on continuing to do this. So I'm just trying to make sure that people are actually getting some benefit out of it. So, all right.
Yeah.